Turning now to the ongoing search for Savannah's mom, Nancy, now entering its fourth week. Volunteer groups are canvassing the neighborhood around her home as the sheriff says leads are still pouring in. NBC's Liz Crodds joins us from Tucson this morning. Good morning, Liz. Good morning. Let's hope week 4 brings the answers everyone is desperately waiting for. While the sheriff says there's still no suspect, he does believe investigators are getting closer to identifying additional clothing connected to the case. The kidnapper was wearing, but he also acknowledged that processing DNA from the home has been challenging. 10 words. That's all it took for the sheriff to dismantle what many believe was the most critical piece of evidence in this case. Not with a hammer, not with fire. With words, our lab tells us there are challenges with it. 10 words delivered calmly on camera to NBC News while the entire country watched, and every single one of them, some argue, sounded like doubt disguised as certainty, a suit, not a legal lie. The sheriff did not commit perjury. He did not fabricate a quote. He did not invent a fact. What he did was worse. He chose words that were technically true but emotionally false. Words designed to make you feel one thing while the reality was something completely different. Words that kept you calm while the case was collapsing. Words that kept you patient while the clock was running out. Words that kept you hopeful while the evidence was dying. And I can prove it because today, federal law enforcement sources broke their silence. CBS News, Fox News Digital, NBC News, 3 separate outlets, multiple sources. And what they said does not match what the sheriff told you. Not even close. The sheriff said challenges. The sources said low-level. The sheriff said mixed. The sources said most of the DNA belongs to people who were supposed to be there. The sheriff said resolve itself. The world's leading genetic genealogist said there was another option he never mentioned. The sheriff said, our lab. He never told you the lab is in Florida, nearly 2,000 miles from Tucson, and there may be a reason he chose it instead of the FBI. The sheriff said, hopeful. Sources said, the DNA may never be usable, 5 words, 2 interpretations. And by the time this is over, you may understand what the sheriff could have been concealing, who it may have been kept from, and who else might have been listening to every word he said. Because there was one more audience the sheriff may have overlooked, the kidnapper. And every word he chose may have told that person more than intended. Person exactly how much time they have. This is the dictionary. Before we open the dictionary, you need to understand what the DNA was supposed to be in this case. Because without that context, you cannot understand how devastating these translations are. Nancy Guthrie, 84 years old, mother of Today's Show host Savannah Guthrie, was taken from her bed in the Catalina foothills outside Tucson, Arizona sometime in the early morning hours of February 1st. Her doorbell camera disconnected at 1:47 a.m. Her pacemaker app disconnected from her phone last pinged at 2:28 a.m. 41 minutes. That's the window. Blood confirmed as hers was found on her porch. She has not been seen since. No suspects have been named. No persons of interest have been publicly identified. Multiple people have been detained and released. The investigation is now 25 days old, but crucial DNA evidence exists. Investigators recovered biological material from inside Nancy's home that did not belong to her or anyone known to have been there recently. That DNA was supposed to break the case wide open. Idaho murders. DNA from a trash pole identified Brian Cobberger in 47 days through the FBI's Quantico lab and genetic genealogy. In the Golden State Killer case, degraded DNA from decades-old crime scenes identified Joseph D'Angelo through genetic genealogy. In the Gilgo Beach case, pizza crust DNA led investigators to Rex Hoyerman. DNA solves cases. That is not a slogan. It is a statistical reality. The FBI's genetic genealogy program has identified suspects in hundreds of cases since 2018. The technology exists. The labs exist. The databases exist. The question in the Nancy Guthrie case was never whether DNA could identify the kidnapper. The question was, how fast? For weeks, the sheriff gave the public carefully chosen words designed to keep that question unanswered, until now. Dictionary entry number 1, challenges. What he said. Our lab tells us there are challenges with it, and we understand those challenges. But the lab also knows the technology is advancing, faster than the answers the public has been given so fast and in such a frenzy that they think some of this stuff will resolve itself just in a matter of weeks, months, or maybe a year. What was actually happening? The DNA recovered from inside Nancy Guthrie's home is what sources are now calling low-level. That term comes directly from a source close to the investigation who spoke to CBS News. A second law enforcement source told CBS that a low-level sample means there was not enough DNA material present to get a clean and reliable result. Separately, two federal law enforcement sources told Fox News Digital that most of the DNA recovered from inside NY's home traced back to people who had legitimate access, known visitors, family, workers. Out of everything they collected, only one unknown sample exists, and that one sample yielded only a partial profile that was insufficient to check against CODIS, the FBI's national DNA database. The translation. Let me be very specific about what the sheriff did here. The word challenges is a word that contains hope. When your mechanic says there are challenges with your engine, you expect the car to run again. When your doctor says there are challenges with your treatment, you expect a path forward. Challenges are temporary. Challenges are solvable. That is the emotional architecture of that word. But low-level is not a challenge. Insufficient to check against COTUS is not a challenge. Not enough DNA material to get a clean and reliable result is not a challenge. Those are outcomes. Those are verdicts. And the sheriff knew the difference. He chose challenges because challenges buys time. It buys patience. It buys public goodwill. And most importantly, it buys silence. Because nobody riots over challenges. Nobody demands answers over challenges. Challenges are the word you use when you want people to wait quietly. The Pima County Sheriff's Department confirmed to CBS News that the contracted lab in Florida is continuing to analyze the samples and has not reached a conclusion on whether they're usable. Read that again. 25 days. And the lab has not even determined if the DNA is usable. That is not a challenge, that is a crisis, and the sheriff called it challenges. Entry number 2, mixed. What he said. We believe we may have some DNA that could belong to our suspect, but we won't know until it's separated, sorted, maybe admitted to COS, maybe analyzed through genetic genealogy. We have DNA. Trust me, if we knew who it was, we'd be on it. Every word chosen carefully, every pause calculated, leaving the public waiting while the clock keeps ticking. Have some DNA and we continue to work with those with the lab on that DNA analysis. Is that DNA that you believe might be the suspects? It just doesn't match anyone in a lab, or what we have is we have some DNA and we don't know whose it is. So we'll keep looking. Well, that's significant. Well, it is. Yeah. And that was from the house. I'm not telling you where it was. We have DNA. The other interesting thing he talked about is challenges with the DNA, which we hadn't heard that they were having challenges. He says that their Florida lab that they're using is having challenges because the DNA is mixed, is what he said. Which is causing delays in testing the DNA. So that's obviously not good news. We'll have to see. I mean, the science is changing so quickly with DNA testing. The word mixed by itself is technically accurate. There was DNA from multiple people. But here is what mixed was concealing. According to two federal sources who spoke to Fox News Digital, most of the DNA traces back to people with legitimate access to the home. Family, visitors, workers, people who had a reason to be there. The mixture the sheriff described was not a swirl of mysterious unknown DNA from multiple unidentified individuals. It was NY's home. People she knew had been there. Their DNA was there. That is normal. The only thing that mattered, the only thing that could break this case was the unknown sample. And there is only one unknown sample, one partial profile, one shot. The translation when the sheriff said mixed. He let the public believe that investigators were sitting on a complex forensic puzzle. Multiple unknown DNA sources that needed to be separated and analyzed. That sounds like progress. That sounds like there is a lot of material to work with. That sounds like the problem is just sorting it all out. The reality is the opposite. They do not have too much unknown DNA. They have almost none. Most of what they collected was identifiable and irrelevant. The one unknown sample, the only potential link to whoever took Nancy from her bed, is partial, low-level, and may never be usable. Mixed made. It sounds like the evidence was rich but tangled. The truth is, the evidence is thin and possibly dying. Genetic genealogist Colleen Fitzpatrick explained to NBC News what the sheriff's language likely meant. If the mixture is 90% NY's DNA and 10% someone else's, there may not be enough of the unknown contributor's genetic material to build a usable profile. The question, she said, is not just whether you can separate it, but whether there is enough to work with even after separation. Dictionary entry number 3, the word resolve itself. What he said, our lab also knows that the technology is moving so fast and in such a frenzy that they think some of this stuff will resolve itself just in a matter of weeks, months, or maybe a year. What was actually happening? There was another option. There was always another option, and the sheriff did not mention it. C.C. Moore is the chief genetic genealogist at Paraben Nano Labs. She has helped solve hundreds of cold cases using investigative genetic genealogy. She is arguably the most recognized name in forensic genetic genealogy in the world. And on February 25th, she told Fox News Digital something that reframes this entire conversation. Moore explained that the DNA system the sheriff was waiting on, CODUS, relies on something called STR testing, short tandem repeat. It compares 20 specific genetic markers against the FBI's database. And for a sample to enter CODUS, it has to be, in Moore's words, practically perfect. And we know that this is something that the Puma County Sheriff's Department is looking at when it comes to the Nancy Guthrie case. How long can it take, though, when you have a potential DNA sample and you go through this route of genetic genealogy? It can take quite a bit of time. Now, fortunately, the sheriff sent the DNA to a private lab that is kind of a one-stop shop. They're great at extracting the DNA from the evidence and then creating 2 separate profiles. The one that's uploaded to CODUS, the type of profile law enforcement has used for decades, and then the different type of profile that we need for genetic genealogy. And so, it will save time to send it there because they were able to create both of those profiles in parallel. So we don't lose time when they don't get a CODUS hit, they can jump right to the genetic genealogy. Once they get that profile created, which is hundreds of thousands of genetic markers span the genome. In this case, at least one of the samples is a mixture. The lab must work with bioinformatics scientists to separate the DNA and ensure they're analyzing the person of interest's profile. Once that's done, it's uploaded to databases that cooperate with law enforcement on the genealogy side. Unfortunately, even though over 50 million people have taken direct-to-consumer DNA tests, finding a match is far from guaranteed. Tests, the top 3 companies have barred law enforcement's use, and so we are limited to the 3 smallest databases: Jade Match, Family Tree DNA, and DNA Justice. The partial profile from NY's home is not practically perfect. It cannot enter CODUS. That door is closed. But here is what Moore said next, and this is the part that no one in the sheriff's department has told the public. You could absolutely use that same sample to create a SNP profile. SNP testing, single nucleotide polymorphism, is completely different from STR testing. Instead of 20 markers, it tests for hundreds of thousands. It is the technology behind investigative genetic genealogy. It is what caught the Golden State Killer. It is what identified Brian Cobberger. And it works on degraded, partial, and incomplete samples that CODUS cannot process. Moore also said that even a partial STR profile, one that cannot enter CODUS, can still be used to obtain an arrest warrant if investigators have a suspect to compare it against. 10 markers, 13 markers, not enough for the database but enough for a courtroom. The translation, the sheriff said, resolve itself. Resolve itself. As if the DNA is a weather pattern, as if investigators should sit in a room and wait for science to improve while an 84-year-old woman is missing, and every day her chances diminish. Resolve itself is passive. It implies that the only option is patience. It frames the delay as an act of nature, not a choice. But it was a choice. There were other labs. There were other methods. There was a path that did not require waiting a year for technology to catch up. David Middleman, CEO of Orem, the Texas-based forensic laboratory that has solved thousands of cases using genetic genealogy, told Fox News Digital weeks ago that once a DNA profile is built, there are leads immediately. In the worst case, it connects you to a close relative. In the best case, it gives you your suspect. The timeline, days, not a year, days. And here is a detail that makes this translation even more devastating. In a previous interview with News Nation, C.C. Moore said it was actually a good decision to send it to DNA Labs International because that lab has the capability to create SNP profiles for genetic genealogy, something the FBI cannot do in-house. Moore said this allows investigators to run both STR and SNP analyses in parallel, just as they did in the Cobberger case. So the lab itself may not be the problem. The lab may actually have the right tools. The problem is the sheriff's public framing, presenting a year-long wait as the only reality when experts who work with this exact science say there are faster paths available from that same lab. Dictionary entry number 4, the word our lab. What he said, we listen to our lab. Our lab tells us that there's challenges. Our lab also knows that the technology is moving so fast. What was actually happening? Our lab, 2 words. Listen to how possessive they are. Our lab, it sounds institutional. It sounds like the sheriff's department has a sophisticated in-house forensic operation, like the evidence is being processed by his team under his watch in his building. The lab is DNA Labs International. It is a private forensic laboratory located in Deerfield Beach, Florida. It is over 2,000 miles from Tucson, Arizona. The Pima County Sheriff's Department has a contract with DNA Labs International that runs from 2022 through March 2026 and is valued at approximately $200,000. This according to Reuters. The FBI has its own forensic laboratory at Quantico, Virginia. That lab processed the Brian Cobberger DNA in the Idaho murders case and produced an identification through genetic genealogy in approximately 6 weeks. Quantico has a direct pipeline to Orem, the Texas-based forensic lab that has solved thousands of cold cases. Author's co-founder Kristen Middleman told Fox News Digital that bypassing this pipeline was devastating. When asked about this decision, the sheriff told Fox 10 investigator Justin Lum that sending evidence to the private lab was about keeping related evidence together for consistency. He added to suggest the sheriff blocked evidence is just crazy. The translation: why does the sheriff say our lab instead of DNA Labs International in Deerfield Beach, Florida? Because our lab sounds like control. It sounds like proximity. It sounds like the sheriff has his hand on the wheel. If he names the lab, the public can look it up. The public can compare it. The public can ask why the FBI's lab was not used. And then the public starts asking questions the sheriff does not want to answer. Questions about 2015. Questions about the FBI investigation into the Pima County Sheriff's Department for alleged misuse of civil asset forfeiture funds. Questions about why the department's then administrative aide, Mark Ratke, was indicted and pled guilty to 3 misdemeanors. Questions about why Nanos, who was chief deputy at the time, was never charged though he lost the 2016 election for sheriff. Questions about a KGUN9 interview in which Nanos called the FBI's allegations total BS. Questions continue. About whether a sheriff who appears to blame the FBI for costing him an election would trust the FBI with the most important case of his career. Sources: KGUN9 interview 2016 York Post. Aaron Cross quotes Fox 10 Justin Lum interview 2016 election records Pima County. Our lab is a wall. It keeps the public from seeing behind it. And behind it is a decision that multiple law enforcement sources, A forensic laboratory co-founder and the president of the Sheriff's Own Deputies Union have questioned dictionary entry number 5, the word hopeful. What he said: "I'm hopeful the samples will get to a point where they can be submitted." What was actually happening? Sources close to the investigation told CBS News that there are concerns that DNA recovered from Nancy Guthrie's Tucson, Arizona home may not yield a usable profile for comparison in federal and private sector DNA databases. Let me put those two statements side by side one more time. The sheriff said he is hopeful. Sources say there are concerns. The DNA may not yield a usable profile. Hopeful and may not yield a usable profile do not live in the same universe. Hopeful is what you feel on your way to a job interview. May not yield a usable profile is what you hear when the case is slipping through your fingers. The translation: the word hopeful is designed for one audience and one audience only: the cameras. It is a media word. It is the word a public official uses when they want to project confidence without committing to a timeline, a result, or a promise. It is the political equivalent of a shrug dressed in a suit. But here is who hopeful failed: Savannah Guthrie, the family, the public, and Nancy. Because while the sheriff was being hopeful on camera, Savannah was sitting in Tucson waiting. For 24 days, the family posted videos. They offered to pay ransom. They offered to talk. They offered $1 million. They waited 9 days in silence between videos 3 and 4. And when Savannah finally came back on camera on February 24th, she said 5 words that revealed what she had been told behind closed doors. She may already be gone. Those 5 words were not the words of a daughter who had been told the DNA situation was hopeful. Those were the words of a daughter who had been briefed on something much worse. Coming on to say it is day 24 since our mom was taken in the dark of night from her bed. And every hour and minute and second, and every long night has been agony since then of worrying about her, and fearing for her, and aching for her, and most of all just missing her. We know millions of you have been praying, people of every faith and no faith at all, praying for her safe return, and we feel those prayers. Please keep praying without ceasing. We still believe in a miracle. We still believe she can come home. ABC News reported that the family had been kept informed as leads failed to pan out. Sources say they were briefed on the challenges, but that's the sheriff's word. The family heard a different story, different translation. The 9-day silence between Savannah's 3rd and 4th videos tells its own story. Between February 15th and February 24th, the woman who spent her career talking to America every morning went dark. When she came back, she had changed the vocabulary entirely. Return became recovery. We will pay became $1 million reward. We believe became hope against hope. The language of rescue had become the language of acceptance. The sheriff said hopeful. The daughter said gone. Somebody was not telling the truth. Now we close the dictionary and ask the question that nobody covering this case is asking. When the sheriff chose these 5 words, challenges mixed resolve itself, our lab hopeful, who was he actually speaking to? The obvious answer is the media, the cameras, the public. But there is another audience the sheriff was not thinking about, or maybe he was, and that makes it worse: the kidnapper. Every word the sheriff said about the DNA was heard by the person who took Nancy Guthrie from her bed, and those words told that person exactly how much danger they were in, or more precisely, how little. Let me translate the sheriff's dictionary from the kidnapper's perspective. Challenges equals they are struggling with the evidence. I have time mixed equals my DNA is tangled with other people's. They cannot isolate mine. Resolve itself in weeks, months, or maybe a year equals I have months before they can identify me. Maybe a year. Our lab equals they are not using the FBI's best resources. The federal government's most advanced forensic tools are not on my trail. Hopeful equals even the sheriff does not sound confident. The DNA may never identify me. President Trump understood this. On February 19th aboard Air Force One, Trump criticized investigators for publicly disclosing the use of pacemaker tracking technology in the search. But the pacemaker disclosure is only one leak. The DNA dictionary is a slow, steady drip of intelligence delivered directly to the suspect through every press conference, every interview, every carefully chosen word. A federal law enforcement source told the Daily Mail that the sheriff's approach was dumb and insane. A Reuters investigation reported that federal investigators believed the sheriff's department was blocking evidence from reaching the FBI. Sergeant Aaron Cross, president of the Puma County Deputies Organization, told the New York Post that this case had become an ego case for the sheriff. Former Chief Deputy Richard Carmona said colleagues were disappointed at the level-retire lack of leadership and called the sheriff's public remarks quite embarrassing. Think about what competent crisis communication looks like. When the FBI identified Bryan Kohberger in Idaho, they said nothing about the DNA for weeks. Silence. No press conferences about challenges, no interviews about timelines, no dictionary of reassuring words for the suspect to decode. Investigators in Idaho went dark, worked the evidence, and showed up at Kohberger's door in Pennsylvania 47 days later with handcuffs. The suspect never saw it coming because nobody told him it was coming. In this case, the sheriff has given approximately a dozen interviews about the DNA. Each one provided more detail than the last. First, it was challenges, then mixed, then maybe a year, then hopeful. Each word narrowed the suspect's anxiety and widened his window to act, to clean, to run, to destroy whatever evidence he has not already destroyed. The FBI understood this. Their Phoenix field office has been notably quieter than the sheriff throughout this investigation. The Bureau offered $100,000 in reward money. They released the doorbell camera footage. They provided the suspect description and then they stopped talking. Every major leak, every timeline disclosure, every DNA update has come from the sheriff's office, not the FBI. Every word was a gift to the kidnapper, and the sheriff was the delivery service. On February 24th, Savannah Guthrie posted a video on Instagram offering a family reward of up to $1 million for any information leading to NY's recovery. Not her return, her recovery. That word works whether Nancy is alive or dead. Within 12 hours, more than 750 calls flooded the FBI's tip line. A senior law enforcement official told NBC News the volume was notable and appreciated. A separate federal official offered this assessment. We don't need another 1,000 calls, we need one. Money can erode a lot of allegiances. Read that quote again. Money can erode a lot of allegiances. That is a federal official saying out loud that there may be someone who knows something, and an accomplice, a witness, a neighbor, a friend who has been staying silent out of loyalty or fear, and $1 million might be enough to break that silence. The reward does not require an arrest. It does not require a prosecution. It requires only NY's recovery, and it can be split between multiple claimants. That structure is significant. It means someone could collect anonymously by providing only location information. The family is not asking for testimony. They are asking for a GPS coordinate. The total reward pool is now over $1.2 million. $1 million from the family, $100,000 from the FBI, $102,500 from the 88 Crime Anonymous Tip organization funded by an anonymous donor. And here is the part that tells you where the family's head is. On the same day Savannah announced the reward, the family donated $500,000 to the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. Savannah said the family understands that we are not alone. In our loss, not our situation, not our crisis loss. That is the vocabulary of grief. That is a family that has been briefed on what challenges actually means and has begun the process of accepting what hopeful could not deliver. What else is happening on day 25? While the dictionary was being written in real time, several other developments unfolded. The second visit. 2 law enforcement sources confirmed to NBC News and separately to ABC News and CNN that the images released by the FBI on February 10th were not all taken on the same night. One image, the one showing the masked suspect without a backpack, was captured on an earlier date before February 1st. This means the suspect visited NY's front door at least twice. The first time, according to one theory shared by sources, he may have noticed the camera and was scared off. He came back later prepared and attempted to disable it. This confirms pre-operational surveillance. This was not a crime of opportunity. Someone planned this. Someone scouted NY's home. Someone came to her door, assessed the security, left, and returned with a backpack, a gun, gloves, and a balaclava. Former FBI agent Jason Pack told ABC News that this indicates preparation and planning consistent with a more sophisticated type of criminal activity than someone just showing up. Investigators had already asked neighbors to check their security cameras going back to January 1st. That request now makes sense. They were looking for the first visit. They were trying to narrow the window of when the suspect began watching NY's home. The volunteer search. With few official updates, civilian search groups have organized on their own. Over the weekend, approximately 12 to 15 volunteers broke into groups and searched roadways surrounding NY's neighborhood. They found a black glove at the intersection of First Avenue and East Camino, Alberta, approximately 2.3 miles from NY's home, near the same location where the February 13th search warrant was served. They also found a Swiss gear backpack 2.8 mi away, which the Pima County Sheriff's Department said appears unconnected to the case. The FBI's Phoenix field office responded to the tip surge by posting a public message asking people to stop calling with well wishes or case theories. The tip line, the FBI said, is not for personal messages to the Guthrie family. The message was direct. Submit only serious and detailed fact-based information. Before we close this dictionary, fairness requires the other side. There are reasons a sheriff might choose the words he chose. Not all of them are sinister. First, the Florida lab has not reached a final conclusion. The Pima County Sheriff's Department confirmed to CBS News that DNA Labs International is continuing to analyze the samples and has not reached a conclusion on whether they're usable. It is possible, though increasingly unlikely, that additional analysis will extract a usable profile. The sheriff may have been protecting the process by not declaring it dead. Second, C.C. Moore herself said on News Nation that sending the DNA to DNA Labs International was actually a good decision because the lab has the capability to run SNP profiles for genetic genealogy in parallel with STR testing for CODIS. The sheriff's lab choice, at least according to one of the leading experts in the field, may not have been the wrong call. Third, disclosing the full extent of the DNA's limitations could compromise the investigation. If the sheriff said publicly that the DNA is low-level and possibly unusable, the kidnapper would know with certainty that forensic science is not closing in. The word challenges, while misleading to the public, may have been strategically ambiguous enough to keep the suspect uncertain about how much danger he was in. Fourth, the sheriff has consistently said his department has 400 personnel working this case and is pursuing leads across multiple investigative tracks. DNA is not the only avenue. The Walmart backpack, the holster identification, the clothing analysis, the thousands of hours of surveillance footage, and the 750 new tips generated by the $1 million reward all represent non-DNA pathways to identification. Fifth, Nanos himself has been emotional on camera. He told NBC, "We're not quitting, we'll find her." That he has said publicly that he wants this case solved as badly as anyone. The criticism from within his department, Cross Carmona, unnamed sources, comes in part from a long-running political conflict that predates the Guthrie case. These are legitimate points. The sheriff is not a villain in a movie. He is a public official managing the most high-profile case in his department's history under extraordinary pressure and unprecedented media scrutiny. But here is the counter, and I will let you decide. If strategic ambiguity was the goal, keeping the kidnapper guessing, then why did the sheriff say maybe a year? That is not ambiguous. That is a timeline. And it is a timeline that tells the kidnapper exactly how long they have. A truly strategic communicator would have said nothing about the DNA at all, or would have said investigators are making progress, or would have deferred to the FBI. Instead, the sheriff walked to a microphone and told the world that the one piece of evidence that could identify the kidnapper might take a year to process. That is not strategy. That is a confession of stalled progress delivered live on national television. I told you this would be a dictionary of 5 words. But there is a 6th word that belongs in this translation, and it is not a word the sheriff said. It is a word the family said, recovery. When Savannah Guthrie announced the $1 million reward, she did not say return, she said recovery. In law enforcement language, recovery works whether the person is alive or dead. Return implies coming home. Recovery implies being found. That word tells you everything about the gap between what the sheriff has been saying publicly and what the family has been hearing privately. The sheriff says hopeful. The family says recovery. The sheriff says challenges. The daughter says she may already be gone. The sheriff says resolve itself. The family donates $500,000 to an organization for missing children in honor of what they are already calling their loss. 2 people can look at the same evidence and use completely different words. When that happens, one of them is lying or one of them is further along in understanding what the evidence actually means. The dictionary has 5 entries from the sheriff and 1 from the family. And the family's entry is the only one that tells the truth. Nancy Guthrie has been missing for 25 days. No suspects have been named. The DNA is partial, low-level, and may never be usable for CODIS. Genetic genealogy through SNP testing remains a possibility, but no timeline has been provided. The glove DNA does not match the house DNA. A second visit to NY's front door has been confirmed. 750 calls have come in since the reward was announced. Over $1.2 million is now available for one piece of information that leads investigators to Nancy. The sheriff used 5 words to describe the state of this case. Comes down to words. The sheriff says, challenges, mixed, resolve itself, our lab is hopeful, sources say. Low-level, partial, insufficient, devastating concerns. The family says just one word, recovery. And somewhere the kidnapper may be reading from that same dictionary, deciding which version to believe. Here, what matters. This isn't just about one sheriff's vocabulary. It's about what happens when the person controlling information chooses comfort over clarity, when the voice behind the microphone decides how much truth the public is allowed to hear. The state of this case comes down to words, the sheriff says. Challenges, mixed, resolve itself, our lab is hopeful, sources say. Low-level, partial, insufficient, devastating concerns. The family says just one word, recovery. And somewhere the kidnapper may be reading from that same dictionary, deciding which version to believe. Here, what matters. This isn't just about one sheriff's vocabulary. It's about what happens when the person controlling information chooses comfort over clarity, when the voice behind the microphone decides how much truth the public is allowed to hear. Can remain anonymous. The family is offering up to $1 million. You do not need to testify. You do not need to give your name. You just need to tell them where Nancy is. Somebody knows. And $1 million can erode a lot of allegiances. This has been the dictionary. Please like this video, subscribe to the channel. Thank you for watching.